Okay, today just want to finish Surah 40, the Forgiver or the Believer, as it's entitled in my copy. So I think last time um, we ended after a description of the story of not so much Exodus, but the confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh, and I explained how Muhammad conflated several different narratives together. So you have Haman, who is a who is the most powerful man in Persia underneath the actual king. You had him introduced as sort of the vizier of Pharaoh. Hi, Mark. Hi, Knight. You had you had Genesis 11 and the building of the Tower of Babel introduced into the context of Pharaoh's disputation with Moses. So you had Genesis 11 and Exodus combined, and you had all of these things. Basically, the upshot of this was for Muhammad to exhort his followers not to question him or not to express any criticisms of Islam itself. And the story itself is an illustration of why this is such a bad idea, because the Quran, the book he's exhorting his followers to believe, and he wants them to be convinced that it's created by God, that it's eternal, it's timeless. That book is riddled with inaccuracies. Just in this one chapter alone, it's filled with anachronisms, it's filled with scriptural error. And we ended with we ended on verse 56, where it says, "Surely as for those who dispute about the communications of Allah without any authority that has come to them, there is not in their breasts but a desire to become great, which they shall never attain to. Therefore seek refuge in Allah. Surely he's the hearing, the seeing." So here's where this is basically the gist of this entire very muddled, confusing narrative, or series of narratives stitched together. Not to question Muhammad, because he is a prophet and he's an apostle of Allah. He's the seal of the prophets. But what he's accusing his critics of, he's doing himself, because he's a self-declared prophet. And if you compare Muhammad, if you test him against Second Timothy or the Book of Revelation, particularly Revelation 22:18, you'll find that he did everything the Bible tells you not to do, and he fails every test there is for being a legitimate prophet, a legitimate apostle, including the test in Deuteronomy, which is if your predictions, if your sayings, if what you say doesn't come to pass, then you are not a prophet, and people should not follow you. They should just ignore you, which is what many people did with Muhammad for the first decade plus of his proselytizing. The Arab tribes he was trying to convert, his tribe, the Quraysh, simply ignored him, which is why he began to resort to caravan raids and violence and coercion. And that was the recipe for success in the case of Muhammad. So, just to continue this, in verse 64, it says, well, actually, let's begin in 61. Allah is he who made you the night that you may rest therein, and the day to see. Most surely Allah is gracious to men, but most men do not give thanks. That is Allah, your Lord, the creator of everything. There is no God but he. Whence are you then turned away? Thus were turned away those who denied the communications of Allah. I'm sorry. Allah is he who made the earth a resting place for you and the heaven a canopy. And he formed you, then made goodly your forms, and he provided you with goodly things. That is Allah, your Lord. Blessed then is Allah, the Lord of the worlds. And again, this is just another example, and this is repeated throughout the Quran, where he says heaven is a canopy, or he describes mountains as if they're tent pegs, basically holding the earth in, and they prevent earthquakes. And I've already said this before several times, but Muhammad didn't understand. He didn't understand geology. He didn't understand astronomy. The idea that an earthquake is the lithosphere releasing energy, that it's tectonic plates shifting against one another, and these things actually create mountains. He thought the mountains were placed there by Allah in order to prevent earthquakes. And when he says the heaven is a canopy, he doesn't mean that in a figurative sense. Muhammad would have been, if Muhammad existed in the 21st century, he would be one of those idiots on the internet that is proposing all sorts of alternative explanations, um, like the idea that the sky is actually a hologram, or that the Earth is, or that the Earth is flat. And in fact, in the Quran itself, it describes the Earth as being flat. It describes a geocentric universe where everything revolves around the Earth, and also the idea that the Earth itself is flat. Because when Muhammad would look at the horizon, he wouldn't understand. He wouldn't have the scientific knowledge to understand what he was looking at. So if he saw the sun going down below the horizon, he thought it was disappearing into something. So for example, when in the Surah of the Prophets, when he describes Dul Qarnayn, i.e., Alexander the Great, he describes the sun going down into a muddy puddle. In my translation, it says the sea, but that's even dumber than the common translation, because if you say the sun's going down into something, it doesn't matter if it's the Pacific Ocean or the Mediterranean or a tiny puddle. The sun is not being submerged. When you see it disappearing, when you see sunset, that's not what's happening. It's not going down into a body of water or disappearing. But Muhammad did not understand that. So when it says here, the earth is a resting place for you and heaven a canopy, he means that literally. He's not using figurative language here. It's just that Muhammad did not understand science. He did not understand how science worked. He was not an astronomer or a geologist. And this is forgivable if Muslims would look at the Quran as something made by a ignorant Arab caravan trader and warlord, and not something created by God from time immemorial. The idea that the Quran has always existed. And again, as I said in another video, that itself has been a source of dispute. And Nabil Qureshi writes about this in his apologetics text, No God But One, where Muslims who believed in the eternality of the Quran were actually persecuted by some early caliphs because it conflicted with the idea of Tawheed, or unification, what Muslims call oneness, this idea of Allah being alone and there not being anything else associated with Allah. But if you say the Quran is eternal, then you're essentially associating other attributes with Allah. So this became a source of conflict, even though this is something that's universal. This is a belief that's universally held among Muslims today. It's one that was a source of schism and deep conflict in the early Muslim empires. And Nabil Qureshi brings this up in his work. And I think a lot of Muslims are just simply ignorant of this because they haven't done a lot of study of the historiography of Muhammad, of the history of Islam. A lot of Muslims uh, like to particularly I idealize the early Muslim empire, particularly Muhammad, and what are some called the four rightly guided caliphs, the Rashidun Caliphate. They like to see this as now. Some of them will just look back to Muhammad himself and think that his death um, kind of ended the halcyon days of Islam, but most will look at either the first four caliphs or the very early part of Islam's spread across Arabia and idealize it as some sort of um, panacea and say, well, we only have to go back to that. And the problem is, whenever Muslims try to do this, try to recapture the ostensible glory of Islam and the beginnings of Islam, they wind up creating a ruinous state, like just like when you have socialists and Marxists try to create a utopia, any sort of man-made utopia, it ends in disaster. And you can see that in places like the Islamic Republic of Iran, or or any or the Taliban, the period during which the Taliban controlled the Afghan government, or the recently destroyed Islamic State. That's another great example. These were all Muslims who tried to recapture the glory and the prestige of early Islam. And in terms of a in terms of a political utopia, most of these outside of Islam, the predecessor for that is always the French Revolution. This idea of a Rousseauian, egalitarian, perfect state created by man. And almost all of the horrific totalitarian regimes that we've seen in the 20th and the 21st century stem from the philosophy that undergirded the French Revolution. In fact, it's actually mentioned in this book, Beyond Belief by V.S. Nepal, which I'm reading now, how the initial Islamic Revolution was tinged by French idealism. And it was a combination not just of a totalitarian 12er Shia dogma, but it was also influenced by these Marxist currents and an infatuation with the ideals that animated the French Revolution, particularly because of the exposure among the elite and the upper class in Iran, the disenchanted who were trying to overthrow the Shah, with French culture. And this influenced a lot of the revolutionary movements within Russia during before the demise of the Romanov dynasty. So we continue the chapter in verse 70. It says, those who reject the book. Before that, it's just a repetition of different ways of saying what people who reject Allah's communications, why they're wrong. So in 70, it says, those who reject the book and that which we have sent our apostle, but they shall soon come to know, when the fetters and the chains shall be on their necks, they shall be dragged into boiling water. Then is the fire. Then in the fire shall they be burned. Then shall it be said to them, where is it that which you used to set up besides Allah? They shall say, they are gone away from us. Nay, we used not to call upon anything before. Thus does Allah confound the unbelievers. That is because you exulted in the land unjustly, and because you behaved insolently. Enter the gates of hell to abide therein. Evil then is the abode of the proud. So be patient. Surely the promise of Allah is true. So should we make you see part of what we threaten them with, or should we cause you to die? To us shall they be returned. And this is interesting because um, this is interesting because it illustrates the emphasis of Muhammad and his attempt to concretize the fear that he wanted to inspire in his followers. So Jesus talks a lot about hell, especially in comparison to all of to um, other important figures, other prophets and people. Even though hell is something that's described in the Old Testament, Jesus focuses a lot of his attention on hell when he's talking to in conversation, um, particularly in particularly in the Gospels where he's encountering people who are scoffing or attacking his divinity. And I think one of the reasons is because he is the Son of God, and he has the authority to to determine their ultimate fate. So he's the judge. He's entrusted with this position. And if someone else came and described hell, one of the most um, probably the most objectionable thing that people have uh, wh- when they're challenging, and you'll find this a lot, particularly with atheists, people challenging the idea of the gospel. They'll point to hell and ask, how can God how can God cast people into hell, or how force them to suffer eternal conscious torment? How can he do this? And I think one of the reasons Jesus talks so much about hell is because he's the one who has the authority to do that. If other prophets had spent as much time talking about hell, it probably would not have registered. But when Mohammed describes hell, he gives you these details, these very vivid, lurid details that don't really have a scriptural basis. Now, the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, it actually does describe a very tangible. It does paint a very vivid word picture of hell, of Lazarus uh, burning and asking Abraham to send of the rich man burning rather, and asking Abraham to send Lazarus to dip his tongue in water. But that's one parable, and it's done to emphasize what's needed. Now, a lot of people use that as an illustration um, of like works based soteriology, and how, but it really isn't. It's an illustration of what determines your ultimate fate after you leave this earth. And it really does come down to faith, because Lazarus is told, when he asks if Abraham could send someone who came back from the dead to send this message of hell, and he's told, if they don't believe the prophets, what good is someone coming back from the dead? And of course, this is an allegory for Jesus himself. But even though you have that very vivid picture, the main takeaway from Jesus, when he's talking about hell, he's trying to impress the importance of this on the people he's speaking to. He's not trying to terrify people into confessing him and following him. And in fact, Jesus at points seems almost disinclined. He says, "You can't be my follower if you're not willing to forsake forsake everything. If you want to esteem something as much as me, as your Lord, then you can't be my follower." And in fact, they turn away and en masse, except for the apostles themselves. And when he points this out to Peter, Peter says, "How can we?" Um, I'm paraphrasing. How can we leave when you have the words of life? He's God, so he doesn't want to terrify people into following him. He's simply using this parable as an illustration of the consequences people's decisions, and the consequences of belief in God, or conversely rejection of God. He's trying to hammer home this point, whereas Muhammad is trying to simply inspire fear and terror in his followers. That's what he's trying to do, which is why whenever he describes hell, he uses all of these very lurid, just horrifying details that could come from a Stephen King novel or a Clive Barker novel. Just these gory, absurd details that you won't find anywhere in scripture, like having molten lava poured down your throat, or or just constantly just being tortured. These don't resemble something you would find in scripture so much as something you would find in classical Greek antiquity, or Roman antiquity, and their mythology, or the gods of the old, uh, or the old Norse gods, the pre-Christian pagan gods, and the myths surrounding them. For example, Loki, who was tied to a tree with his own entrails, as acid was being dripped into a pan, and it would hit his face before he was ultimately released. So it resembles, more than anything, those type of legends and myths, more so than any sort of hell described in scripture. The eschatology of Muhammad and Islam is much more similar to myths, of ancient deities, than it is to anything you would find in the Bible. But so I just wanted to make that point. But in 79 it says, Allah is he who made the cattle for you that you may ride on some of them, and some of them you may eat. Now I made a little note here just with an arrow, and I said banal, which is also true, but it's also uh, there are some things in the Quran that you come across that you wonder why they're there. It's filled with repetition. It's one of the more tedious books, and even Gary Wills, who's a very liberal, uh, ostensibly Catholic writer who's written a lot of books. He wrote a book about Paul, which actually wasn't too bad, but he's a writer and he wrote a book defending Islam, and even he admits that in the introduction that the Quran is almost an unreadable book. If you were reading it for any other reason than study, like I am for this series, you would not want to read it. It's incomprehensible. And even like David Wood said, the Hadith, there are parts of the Hadith that actually are interesting, if disturbing to read. But the Quran, beyond the barbarity or the obscenity of certain parts, it's just an incredibly tedious and incoherent book. So you have things like this, which just says, Allah is he who made the cattle for you that you may ride on some of them, and some of them you may eat. Now, again, in an early video I mentioned the fact that Muhammad didn't understand livestock, so he said there's versions eight versions of cattle or eight types of cattle, and it's not clear whether he means breeds, in which case he's wrong, or if he's referring to the family of bovine, in which case he's also wrong. But regardless of what he's referring to, he's wrong. He didn't understand that there were people who had other forms of livestock. So he knew about cattle, he knew about camels, just he basically knew about the types of livestock that he would find in his travels or living in Arabia. So he didn't know that there are people who have livestock that are yaks, that are llamas, that are alpacas. There are just dozens of different types of livestock, and this was something Muhammad was unaware of because he was, like I said, ignorant, and his knowledge was delimited by what he encountered or experienced in his life or had heard about. And this is one of the reasons that one of the few persuasive parts of the Quran chat is him disputing with presumably pagan Arabs about the resurrection, because he was raised in as a member of this group. He was from the Quraysh, so he was raised in this sort of environment. So he actually understood and knew the underlying philosophy and religion and belief system. So this was something he actually understood. And it's one of the few parts of the Quran where he actually makes a convincing argument for the idea of a general resurrection. But other things he knew nothing about. So when he talks about livestock or or uh, or the earth or the moon or uh, astronomy, geology, or when he talks about the Bible, the Torah, and the Gospel, things he has much more limited knowledge of, you can spot all of the errors almost immediately. And even back then, people uh, people he was trying to proselytize would say he's telling old legends or legends. They basically understood that he was taking things, various myths, and tales and Arabic folk tales, and trying to pass them off as some sort of revelation that he had been exposed to. So in 80 it continues, and there are advantages for you in them that you may attain thereon, a want which is in your breast, and upon them and upon the ships you are born, and he shows you his signs. Which then of Allah's signs will you deny? And what sign? This is how really dumb Islam is when when you come to it. He's saying signs, and then he's pointing to animals or plants or the or the fact that the sun rises and sets, or that or that there are or that it rains. He's basically pointing to natural events, ecological events, or just just basic facts of nature, and saying this is proof that Allah. When you read about signs in the Bible or signs and wonders, there's actual tangible evidence of God being behind them. So the Egyptian army being drowned in the Red Sea, or Israel being taken out of captivity and claiming Canaan, the land of Canaan, after wandering in the wilderness, or 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 the life of Abraham and Sarah. All of these things are legitimate signs, but when Muhammad is talking about signs, he's talking about naturally occurring events. Now, if you want to attribute those to God, you can attribute them to God, but what evidence is there that Muhammad's God, that Allah, which is really the God that it existed prior to Muhammad, but that he appropriated and changed? What evidence is there that he's responsible for this? That he's responsible for the flowers and the plants or the cows? There's nothing. So when he says signs, you have to realize whenever the idea of signs comes up in the Quran, what he's pointing to are not really signs. Just like Muhammad's military victories, as impressive as they were from a tactical point of view, they're not signs. And if they were signs, then Alexander the Great and Belisarius, Justinian's general, or Scipio Africanus, all of these generals would have been far greater prophets than Muhammad, because they achieved a lot more than simply taking over most of the Arabian Peninsula, which is what was the extent of Muhammad's victories before his death. So in 82 it says, have they not then journeyed in the land, and see how was the end of those before them? They were more in numbers than these, and greater in strength and in fortifications in the land. But what they earned did not avail them. Then when their apostles came to them with clear arguments, they exulted in what they had with them of knowledge, and there beset them that which they used to mock. But when they saw our punishment, they said, we believe in Allah alone, and we deny what we used to associate with him. But their belief was not going to profit them when they had seen our punishment, that is, Allah's law, which has indeed ordained in the matter of his servants, and there the unbelievers are lost. And again, the interesting thing here is Allah's consistently being referred to with a plural pronoun, and he's not saying I, or he's not saying I, he's saying we. He's not saying mine, he's saying our. So this is an implicit acknowledgement that there is a plurality of persons within the Godhead, even though Muslims love to emphasize the oneness, the unification of Allah, the fact that he stands alone, and this is repeated throughout the Quran. Don't call, uh, say not three. Don't don't have associate gods with Allah, which is Muhammad's misunderstanding. He did not grasp the fact that tritheism is not the same as a trinity, and worshiping three separate gods is not the same as worshiping one God, which is triune. So even though you see these things that would make you think that Islam is a strict monad, this unitary religion, a Unitarian belief, it's contradicted by the fact that Allah is continually being referred to as if it is more, or he is more than one person. That it's not simply this Unitarian monad that does not have, that is simply one and singular. And you see this throughout the Quran. Now, that's the end of Surah 40. In my next video, I'll be doing Surah 41, Ha Mim, which is another one of the disjointed letters that this surah takes its title from. And before that, I just would like to end with a very brief quote from the book I mentioned earlier, Beyond Belief by V.S. Nepal. This is the sequel to Among the Believers, which was based on V.S. Nepal's travels to Malaysia, Indonesia, Iran, and Pakistan at the end of the 1970s during a very tumultuous period. So it's basically his profile of 4 non-Arab Muslim nations, and this is the follow-up to that. They're both really fantastic books, and this passage illustrates one of the key differences between Islam and Christianity. So let me just read a little bit from page 81. The chapter is called Below the Lava. And it says, in fact, it was because of the Christian preaching against polygamy and the suffering it had brought in their own lives that Linus's father and mother, as recently as 1938, had converted to Christianity. They had not been Muslims before, but Javanists, with a mixed local religion made up of survivors of Hinduism, Buddhism, and animism. They had both attended Christian schools. They had learned about Christianity there. The Christianity they had adopted had not meant a break with the past. Okay. And it continues. Linus said, Christianity is important because it teaches you to love somebody as you love yourself. It means teaching us to become tender persons, not wild or aggressive persons. In Javanese, we also have the concept of restraint. It's easy, therefore, for Javanese people to embrace Christ's teaching. And the interesting thing here is this family was broken apart because of the Muslim practice of polygamy, and this impacted a lot of families in Indonesia, but other Muslim countries as well. Now, there are some Muslim countries where it's frowned upon and it's not a major social issue, but in many Muslim countries, the practice of polygamy destroys the internal unit of families, and it forces sons and daughters to grow up in poverty, not knowing who their father is, coupled with the Islamic practice of divorce. It's something that really undermines the bedrock of a functioning society, which is a two-parent family. And this is something that's deeply impacted any most major Muslim nations where it's allowed, it's had deep it's had a deep-seated impact on those societies. Okay, so that's Surah 40 and a little brief excerpt from Beyond Beyond Belief. And I'll do Surah 41. I'll begin that in my next video. And thank you for joining me.